So as we get started today, I'd like to acknowledge that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. In particular, I'm speaking to you from Ramaytush Ohlone ancestral land in Half Moon Bay. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions, and we encourage you to learn which tribal nations are indigenous to the area where you are now living. One excellent source of information is Native Land, and we've dropped that link into the chat for you to explore later. Our speaker today, Dr. Faith Kearns, is a scientist and science communication practitioner who focuses primarily on water, wildfire, and climate change in the Western United States. Her work has been published in New Republic, On Being, Bay Nature, and more. She has been working in the science communication field for more than 25 years, starting with the Ecological Society of America and going on to serve as a AAAS, and that's the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, as a Science and Policy Fellow at the U.S. State Department, manage a wildfire research and outreach center with the University of California, Berkeley, and bridge science and policy advocacy efforts at the Pew Charitable Trusts. I met Dr. Kearns virtually in fall 2018 when she was a member of the hiring committee for the UC Climate Stewards academic coordinator position. And I met her personally in spring 2019 after I got the job. Faith also was part of the strategic planning committee that laid the foundation for the UC Climate Stewards course, and her work at the intersection of science, climate change, disaster resilience, and science communication helped direct the social emotional resilience and trauma-aware components of the course. So big thanks to Faith for that. In her new book, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, Dr. Kearns has penned a succinct guide for navigating the human relationships critical to the success of practice-based science communication. This meticulously researched volume takes science communication to the next level, helping scientists see the value of listening as well as talking, understanding power dynamics and relationships, and addressing the roles of trauma, loss, grief, and healing. And I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Kearns. Really looking forward to your presentation. And you are muted.
All right, am I good? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So I want to just thank all my CalNat and Climate Stewards colleagues for inviting me to speak with you all today. And thank you to those of you listening and engaging with this material. So I'm coming to you from the beautiful lands of the Ohlone people who continue to shape this place that we now call the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. As Sarah May mentioned, I work in the California Institute for Water Resources, which is like the Cal Naturalist program in the University of California Division of Ag and Natural Resources. So today I'm going to talk about a different way of communicating science than what has generally been talked about for most of my career, which I've spent sort of doing communications for longer than I've been a scientist, and actually doing science communication since before it really actually had that name. So although I'm also a scientist, I'm very much coming at this as a practitioner and not a researcher of science communication. But for about 25 years, I've been practicing, as Sarah May said, in sort of academia, government, and the nonprofit sector on many environment-related issues, particularly water and wildfire and climate change. So my talk today is the same as the title of my book that came out 2 weeks ago from today, called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication. And so I want to give sort of an overview both of the book and the talk that I will be giving. So my main thesis is just that relating is a key part of the communication challenge that has unfortunately really been largely overlooked in scientific and technical communication efforts. And so everything I'll be talking about today is covered in the book, but I can only talk about a pretty small subset of what's included there. And so I'm going to talk about the context of science communication briefly, and then we're going to talk specifically about some of the tools which I frame as relating, listening, working with conflict, and understanding trauma. And we'll have a breakout group talking about some of those things, and then also touch on what I view as sort of the future of science communication as being equitable, inclusive, and just, and also how we can take care of ourselves and each other in this work. And so I want to also express gratitude to everyone who spoke with me for this book and whose words I can now share with you. So just to start out with the context, So what is science communication? We'll just start there. And in my case, I have a very broad definition, which is the idea of just communicating science with non-experts. However, I really also like to say that's most of us most of the time, right? So even as somebody who is scientifically trained, I certainly do not consider myself an expert in all areas of science. And so I think we can empathize that we're all basically beginners in a lot of cases. And so science communication really has this long global history, and I cite some work in the book that's very interesting in that context. But really what I want to focus on is what I know, which is sort of the past 25 to 30 years in North America, but particularly in the United States. And what we have tended to focus on in science communication is this idea of filling an information gap. So the idea is that people just don't have enough information to act on certain things, right? And then there's also been a huge focus on this idea of sort of connecting what end up being largely elite scientists at elite institutions with elite journalists, say at the New York Times or something like that, and decision makers also at elite institutions. And what I'm trying to argue is that there has been a more ground level science communication practice that has actually existed at the same time as that focus, but has, for better or worse, taken a backseat to these sort of more top-down approaches. So the sage on the stage model has proliferated, but at the same time, we've mostly found that while information is of course important, I'm not arguing that information is irrelevant. That's obviously not true, but on its own, it really doesn't offer much of a theory of change. And I realize the irony that I'm performing that role right now. It's pretty hard to get around, but I would like it to be the beginning of things and not the end. So that in reality, science communication is much more complex. People communicate with each other in complex ways and configurations and places. And we know this on some level, and yet many times our science communication efforts don't really reflect that understanding. And we're starting to see a real shift toward a relational, or what I would call a community engaged model, which is about the people that we're in community with and the communities that they're a part of. And doing science communication in this way is a fundamentally different prospect than the kind of science communication that we have been practicing or focusing on. So another big change in the science communication field is that the people actually doing the work have changed. So again, long considered the domain of tenured faculty, science communicators are increasingly in less secure positions. They're interested in and often part of various communities that have previously been marginalized within the sciences, whether that's by gender, sexuality, ability, age, location of your institution, all sorts of things. And so this diverse group is also changing science communication practice, right? Including by challenging notions of objectivity and advocacy in science. So for example, Sada Kahanamoku, who is a doctoral student at UC Berkeley, wrote a piece about the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii, where she says, to me, this debate is not about science versus culture. In my practice of science, the two are inextricably linked. I am Kanaka Aui, and I do science because I am Hawaiian. I research out of aloha ina, a deep familial love for the land. My cultural upbringing allows me to walk in the space between Western science and traditional ways of knowing, a duality that enriches the questions I ask and the techniques I use to answer them. Many of these science communicators are very much less interested in relying on some of the sort of scientific authority and intellectual distancing that a lot of early science communication focused on. They are instead much more interested in connection and consent. As my colleague Sarah Myrie, who's a climate scientist in Washington State, said, the paradigm of science communication has largely been about the appropriate presentation of scientific authority, which is about divesting from your own mortal and emotional and human connections. You're forced to perform respectability, to posture, and when you try to critique that posture or even just do things differently, you become the problem instead of the thing that's actually a problem. Indeed, the questions, approaches, and outcomes that many science communicators are seeking are quite different than they used to be. Many people live and work in the same communities as the people they work with. I am one of those people, and that makes it a fundamentally different proposition than science and communication that sort of takes place outside of any direct ties to communities. So Mila Marshall, who's a doctoral student at the University of Illinois, for example, has done some work with local nature centers around Chicago and says, nature centers tend to focus on natural landscapes, trees, birds, bugs, fish, watersheds, things like that. But that's not how everybody engages with the land. That kind of typical environmental communication can push people away and make them feel as though you're not talking to people who look like them. It can create this perception that nature is only for white people. You have to know where you are. You have to know who you're talking with. And finally, in addition, folks are often working on what can be emotional, contentious, and traumatic issues. We've got things like water and drought, wildfire and climate change, and of course, the issue that has really made the reality of science communication complexity legible for more people, and that is COVID. So it in fact used to be pretty difficult for me to explain the need for the approach that I'm advocating for today. But COVID has, I think, made it clear to many, many more people, because we're all experiencing it, how science and the communication of science is a political and cultural issue. And this is true for many, many other issues. So as many of us have long argued, science does not exist in a vacuum, and neither does communicating it, and we should most certainly act accordingly. So I want to give a couple concrete examples of how emotion shows up in some of these issues. So this is just one where I'm talking about how emotion shows up in thinking about water. So Sarah Wolf, who's a faculty member at the University of Waterloo in Canada, wrote an article where she basically said, human emotions are complicated and talking about them is never easy. But given the many and multiplying stresses on our drinking water systems, it's time to stop ignoring how powerful and universal emotions such as disgust both help and hinder our water decisions. And she, in this case, is talking about drinking recycled water, which can bring up a lot of feelings for people. Parisa Parsifar, who's also now a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, told me about she's a psychologist, and she had done some research on water and emotion, and says early experiences of disgust and fear are linked to water contamination beliefs and water consumption behaviors among children. Although these might seem like individual issues, fear and disgust can have far-reaching consequences. And in this case, she's talking about, for example, drinking soda or not drinking anything and getting dehydrated. And, obviously for those of us in California, fire is an emotional issue, and increasingly smoke inhalation and visibility is a big issue. My colleague, Karen Tuxen-Bettman, who is a product manager at Google Earth, told me for the book, I grew up in Stockton, California during the time when people would burn ag fields all around the Central Valley in the fall. And that smell just felt like home to me. But I now know that that was dangerous, and today it's strictly regulated. And then she adds, not to mention that these days when I smell smoke, my anxiety spikes because I worry that there's another big wildfire nearby, right? So all of these issues are getting entangled into various types of emotion, conflict, and trauma. And as everybody is really speaking to, these issues are even more amplified when you live in the community where you work. You're not talking about something happening in a far away place. You're actually largely experiencing the same things as other people, but perhaps being asked to make sense of it out of those issues. And you often see the people that you're communicating with at the grocery store, right? So that becomes an issue of accountability. You're not just a talking head on TV. So my colleague, Sarah Watson, who works in another extension program, Sea Grant, in South Carolina, basically described her professional experience saying, I recently had to give several presentations on the local effects of sea level rise to groups like planning commissions and homeowners associations. And each time, at least half the people there were completely freaked out. I myself now get nervous having to say out loud what these climate projections tell us about tidal flooding in the region. It's hard information for communities to hear for what is often the first time, and it's hard for me to give the same bad news over and over again, news that I increasingly worry isn't bad enough to cover where we're headed, but that I simultaneously worry sounds too alarmist for what people are ready to hear. Again, a very common issue. And I also want to note that, while we work on many sort of challenging issues and situations, there is also joy to be found. So for example, Malika Noko, who's a cooperative extension specialist at UC Davis, described to me an experience of being at a really intensive workshop with some colleagues where they were going through public comments on conservation legislation, and afterward were feeling sort of down and decided they needed to think about something more fun. And so they ended up creating something called Plant Love Stories, a campaign that basically, she says, we wanted to focus on more plant appreciation than science and just make it fun. It makes me feel joyful and light. It makes me feel like I can be funny. I have all these parts of my personality that I feel like I have to suppress for science, but with this, I can be goofy and make puns and be a total plant nerd, and it's okay. So with that as the sort of context for how the field is evolving, I want to touch on some of the tools that I propose as being a beginning set of tools that we can use to think about communicating in a different way. So what I'm proposing is this idea of a relationship-centered science communication, which is to say that I really feel we are facing more of a relationship challenge than a communication challenge. And so with a relational focus, the idea is that we relate to each other as equals rather than, for example, pushing behavior change onto others because we assume to be the objective experts know best. And that kind of relating invites different skills, including developing the ability to listen deeply rather than speak perfectly. And then also being able to work with emotions and conflict that come up when you really are doing that kind of deep listening work. I also want to note that relational work is present in many cultures, spiritual traditions, scholarship. So, for example, it's a strong theme in Black feminist scholarship, and many Indigenous scholars from Kim Tallbear to Zoe Todd write about relationality, kinship, ideas like that. Melanie Yahtzee, who is a professor at the University of New Mexico, for example, I interviewed her about this concept that she talks about, which is radical relationality. And here she's trying to make it concrete, talking about the Water is Life movement, where she says, I noticed that with Water is Life, the word life in particular was about countering the politics and reality of death that resource extraction has brought to Native communities, including my own. I call these relations of extraction one-way relationships where resources are extracted from Native lands with no benefits to Native peoples. And that leads us into this radical politics of relationality based on Indigenous understanding of kinship, of relatives, of being in good relations of reciprocity. Those kinds of relations are about protection, about compassion and equality, about a power dynamic that isn't based on extraction and exploitation. It's about mutual respect and simply being a good relative. So in addition to these sort of cultural, spiritual, scholarship pieces, I have drawn a lot from the professions, including law and medicine, and particularly psychotherapy, historian and Harvard professor, that have developed professional relationship-centered approaches. So for example, I spoke with Dr. Theopia Jackson, who's a psychologist at Saybrook University, and she's talking to me about how she thinks about her psychotherapy practice relationally. And so she says, I can think of my practice as a service model where I frame my efforts around being in service of others. And that means I can't come at it from a place of being an expert with all the answers. Instead, maybe I come at it from a place of asking, what do you need? What do you need? Here's what I can offer. Is this helpful? If so, how do I make it accessible to you? If not, what do you need that I might be able to provide? How can we look at this together? Those can become guiding questions for working relationally. Again, this is quite different than how scientists and science communicators have tended to operate. So what does this kind of work look like in a really concrete way? I have lots and lots of narratives in the book that try to concretize this work so that it isn't abstract for people. And one story I can tell comes from my colleagues at UC Cooperative Extension. So during California's last recent long drought, small Hmong farms on leased lands in the Central Valley experienced a widespread mental health crisis that was spurred on by low water allocations. And my colleagues asked what they could do. And though it wasn't work they would have done initially, they changed their approach because it was really what was needed. So Ruth Dahlquist Willard, who's a small farms advisor in Fresno, says, we held multilingual workshops to inform the growers of a state grant process to help with energy efficiency on water pumps and get them started on their applications. And then we offered one-on-one assistance for completing the application and getting all the required documents together. This is not necessarily work that a scientist such as Ruth would have necessarily seen herself doing, but she did what was needed. And then growers were actually able, some of them, to save up to say 65% on water and electricity bills with that new equipment. And that made a huge difference. Michael Yang, who also works with UC Cooperative Extension with Ruth, is Hmong himself, and says, especially for Hmong farmers, water is crucial to grow crops like lemongrass, luffa, long beans, and sugarcane. It was wonderful to see crops grow lush and green because we had water. I just want to note that while listening is a really beautiful practice and something that is worth spending a lot of time thinking about, one of the most important things to also recognize is the ethical challenges of what can be a very extractive process. Again, this is something scientists and technical folks need to be very careful about. So Yana Lambrinidou, who's an anthropologist who does extensive work with communities and actually teaches listening to engineers, told me listening is often diluted to become about empathy and compassion when we're really talking about justice and accountability. How scientists and engineers listen is inseparable from questions of power because it can be done in ways that bolster community knowledge and strengthen scientific understanding of real-world problems. But it can also be done in ways that overlook or distort community knowledge and compromise scientists' ability to help people in ways that are scientifically sound and also experienced as communities, by communities as desirable and just. So I want to give another overview of one of the tools I talk about, which is learning to work with conflict. So when it comes to conflict, it's really challenging because many of us are quite conflict averse, myself included, and other people actually really love it. And it's valuable to see that those are kind of two sides of the same coin. Both give conflict a lot of power that it probably doesn't need. And so I argue and try to practice myself sort of a middle path for increasing comfort with conflict. But just given where we are societally, I also want to note that this does not apply equally. In fact, almost everything I'm talking about is not a one size fits all. So if you're someone who with relative power who avoids conflict, for example, you might want to try to stretch your conflict muscle a bit by punching up, right? And for people who are often placed into conflict situations, it's totally okay to back out of them, right? So this is really a lot about discerning about what works for you, and it's a very complex topic. However, I will say in science communication, people have tended to treat conflict as something to be defeated with information, which is really, I mean, think about any conflict you've ever been involved in. That is simply not how conflict works. And so that is not a great way of thinking about it. So one of my favorite experiences was watching a colleague actually go from conflict avoidant to realize he needed ethically to be okay with it. I mean, it was actually a truly amazing experience where I was talking about some of what I'm talking about with you here. And my cooperative extension colleague, Mark Thorne, went from feeling like climate change wasn't a topic he could broach with the often conservative ranchers he works with to feeling like he had an ethical obligation to. So he told me, The consequences of avoiding talking about the effects of climate change on agricultural production has too many negative consequences for the people I work with and for food security in general at the local, regional, and national levels. I now see it as a professional and ethical obligation to talk about what can be difficult topics, and I have to trust that the long-term working relationships I have are strong enough to handle it. So that's one of the big benefits of thinking relationally, is that instead of like in a transactional situation where you might not be able to bring up difficult topics because you simply don't have the relationship capital to even begin that. If you've got a deep relationship with people, it becomes a little easier to think about. One of the flip sides of conflict that I'm also trying to think about is power. So one of the challenges in science communication is if we have tended to ignore conflict, we almost certainly have completely avoided the topic of power. And so Linda Mendez, who recently received her doctoral degree at UC Davis, says that I think focusing on better communication is in fact distracting. There are these much larger issues of power at stake, and it's convenient to have a lot of very smart people worrying instead about communication. There's definitely some truth to the idea of intentionally letting people fight over the discourse instead of the essence of important policies and processes. And I bring that up because it requires a lot, again, of discernment on the part of the practitioner to understand, are you in a power struggle? Are you in conflict? What is actually going on? And finally, the last piece I'm going to talk about is understanding trauma, which I want to normalize as a sort of widespread issue. Many of us obviously living in California know what it is like to feel traumatized to more and less degrees by wildfire, for example. So Tessa Hill, who is a faculty member at UC Davis, wrote, "Early on the morning of October 9th, 2017, we awoke to multiple friends asking us if we were evacuating. We launched ourselves out of bed, turned on the TV, pulled up social media feeds, and began a frantic hour of messaging friends and family, trying to understand the wildfire chaos around us. By daylight, we noticed that some of the ash was as big as our hands and had legible writing on it. Other large pieces falling into our yard were burned fabric. The remnants of our community were falling from the sky." That fire erased our sense of safety, not just at an individual level, but across the whole county. It was a community scale trauma. And of course, she is talking about the Tubbs fire. We continued in the book to talk about the fires that also followed that. So a couple notes about trauma. In addition to thinking about how trauma affects other people, right, we also have to consider how it affects those of us communicating about these issues year after year, who may both experience the trauma and also be trying to communicate about it, right? So understanding the way that it affects us and others and the combination is very important and very underexplored. So Miriam Kia Keating, a professor of psychology at UC Santa Barbara, talked to me a bit about disasters and trauma and said that, just understanding that there is a psychological impact from disasters is valuable. She said, "Recent events have opened my eyes to the personal distress that natural science researchers and professionals have been experiencing, in part because they are so attuned to the potential risks in our environment. Those who help communities respond to disaster can experience secondary trauma or vicarious trauma." So again, as a practitioner, understanding how you yourself are being affected is really important as you're communicating with other people. And one final note on trauma, it is also incredibly important to be culturally responsible when thinking about trauma. It's no one thing, and not everybody experiences it the same or accepts the level. Again, Dr. Thea Piet Jackson told me that part of the challenge with the trauma bucket is that it's become a catch-all phrase that means different things to different people. It's important not to position people who are dealing with significant issues as having something less about them. Some folks are quite adept and functional despite the context that they live in. Their world is often already much more in perspective. So when that fire happens, they may already be closer to the realization of, hey, I'm still here living, as opposed to their counterpart who has maybe not been exposed to some of the worst things in life. So I hope that overview at least gives you lots of food for thought. And at this point, we want to go ahead and have some group discussion. And so Brooke, I think, is going to come online, and we're going to put people into groups of 4 or so. And the guidance is basically to just take a minute to yourselves to self-reflect on maybe some of the issues that are coming up for you as you listen to this material. My book has reflection questions at the end of every chapter, because I'm trying to give space for people to reflect on how this material fits into their own lives, because these stories may not be the ones that you're dealing with, right? And so I want everybody, each group, to maybe just pick one of these questions where you're looking at either emotion or conflict or trauma, and thinking about the ways that it shows up in your own work or other people's.
All right, everyone, welcome back. I hope you all had great conversations. I know that I did. Please make sure that your microphones are on mute now that we're all back together. And I know that Faith has a few more remarks for us.
Yep, thank you. I'm just going to go over a couple more points, and then we'll open it up for questions for about 15 minutes. So I just want to talk about the field sort of moving forward. And although all of the examples that I've given are through a fairly strong justice lens, I want to underscore the point about the future of science communication really being equitable, inclusive, and just. So science communication training, such as it is, has tended to treat all science communicators as if they're the same, offering a generic set of tools sort of assumed to work for everyone. And getting back to some of my earlier points, this is really not the case. Science communicators are a diverse group of people working with diverse communities. And when you take that seriously, it just fundamentally really changes the practice. So Sergio Avila, who works with the Sierra Club in Southern Arizona, told me about some of his work working with ranchers in Mexico and Arizona and along the borderlands, and how he really had to shift how he communicated to be effective at this work. And he says, too often, scientists create language that is actually meant to exclude people. We build ourselves up as the experts, and then we're supposed to dumb down or simplify our language, which just leads to more feelings of superiority. Scientists walk into a place they don't know at all, acting like they do know it all. And in fact, it is very humbling to meet landowners who truly know a place that I never will. So if we take this comment from Dr. Avila very seriously, in that we actually do things that are meant to exclude people, then it really changes what we think of as the practice. And the final note I want to end on is to just say that this work has become essentially a full body sport. It is really increasingly important to talk about self-care, but rather than approaching it from a sort of individualistic perspective, I really want to highlight folks who are integrating their self and community care. So Lydia Jennings, who's a recent doctoral recipient at the University of Arizona, is one of my idols, to be sure. And in addition to her work as a soil scientist studying mining remediation, she's also a trail runner who is really incredibly excited about all things outdoors. And she has managed to sort of integrate her full self into a trifecta she describes as an indigenous trail running scientist that allows her to combine her love of science and nature with supporting other indigenous runners and scholars. And she says, I love to be outside. I love learning more about the world every day. And I'm also committed to being an active part of a more just future. For me, science is about service, particularly for marginalized communities. And that kind of service is an incredible responsibility with some thorny issues like land dispossession and data sovereignty that require a lot of patience and commitment. So with that, I'm going to stop for now and leave you with information about how you can keep in touch with me. And I look forward to talking with you. I will just note that my book came out 2 weeks ago. It has been very difficult as it is sold out / back ordered in many of the places that you would normally think to buy books. And so I really recommend that if you would like to get it, that you buy it directly from Island Press. There's a link on my website, on my Twitter account, all sorts of places. And you can use the code HEART to get 20% off, which kind of takes care of the shipping of the book. So with that, I think we can open it up to questions, reflections, and that kind of thing. So I will turn it over to, I think, Sarah May to facilitate that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciated your presentation, and it was amazing overview of the book. And we do have a couple questions that came in via email. So the first one is a couple of folks have found that hierarchy can be an impediment to open and high quality communication in general. How do we navigate fairly rigid hierarchies as we try to improve communication of scientific and cultural imperatives?
So I guess I would again kind of, I recognize that as a problem for sure. And I would go back again to this kind of idea of relationship. And I think that because that concept has a lot of potential in terms of thinking about reducing power dynamics. I obviously didn't have a lot of time in this presentation to go into sort of the more theoretical underpinnings of relationality, but one of them is this idea that because you as a practitioner are putting yourself on a similar ground as the people that you're working with, that those power dynamics become something that is open to question. And so that's why I'm arguing for sort of more institutional level relational work and individual level relational work. And I definitely recognize it as a strong uphill battle, but it at least gives room to talk about some of these issues and how we position ourselves as authorities or power figures or experts, and how that can be, sort of spread out more horizontally.
Yeah. Absolutely. Kind of a similar related question, thinking about that cultural space as well. What are some best practices for introducing consideration of TEK, and that's tribal ecological knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, and respect for it within conventional Euroengineering dominated environments?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't feel like I'm the best person to speak to sort of the idea of traditional ecological knowledge at all. I can only go to some of, what, again, the people that I spoke with were willing to share with me, which again, I would say speaks very much to this idea of being in relationship. I think we get into trouble whenever there is a sort of an insistence on being in a position of authority, being in a position of expertise. The way that I try to frame things, I very much use the language that Dr. Jackson uses in terms of thinking about having a relational practice that is much more sort of in service. The other way I try to think about it is how do I put myself into the work too, right? So I'm not approaching somebody from the perspective that I have all the answers. And so that to me immediately makes room for different ways of knowing, which I would very much consider TEK to be in that sort of different ways of knowing category. So I think it's a humility, it's thinking of your work as being in service of, and trying to, as much as possible, reduce the sense that you're an expert with all of the answers, but instead you're kind of locking arms with people and trying to figure out how to move forward together.
Yeah, definitely. That's a beautiful answer, and it's a difficult question, as you said, to speak from not being within that particular community. In chapter 2, you do talk a little bit about the presence of scientifically trained people throughout the workforce, and you didn't really touch on that today. I just wanted to know if you would speak to that a little bit more, and how kind of scientists are everywhere in a way that we're not really anticipating sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really unfortunate that the sort of language that we use around science is sort of you're lost, right? Like there's a pipeline issue, and that if you don't sort of stay in academia, in research, that you are that you've dropped out, which for many, many reasons is a very strange way of looking at things. I can't tell you how many friends I have that are sort of like, well, I'm not a scientist anymore. And I'm like, you are, you're a practitioner, you're working in a government agency, or, working for a nonprofit, but you're still a scientist. And so I think these issues of kind of describing who speaks for science, who has the authority to speak for science, just all of that stuff is it's super interesting, but I think we would all benefit from understanding that there are many scientifically trained and scientifically interested, and sort of the term that I really like, which is organic intellectual, right? Just or whatever terminology you want to use for people who take a scientific approach to thing with maybe not any formal training.
Yeah, and just to speak to that as well, I consider myself a scientist. I have my bachelor's degree in marine biology, my master's in climate science and policy, but I know within the academic sphere, people don't necessarily look at me like that because I don't have a suite of publications to my name. So kind of related to that, just for our naturalists and our stewards, you also kind of talk about a similar issue of the dearth of in-school training for science communication practitioners. And I'm just curious if you see certifications like the UC Climate Steward certification that has a really distinct focus on communication practice. Do you see that filling a gap or need for SciComm practitioners?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, most of the science communication training that's out there is sort of informal and similar, to you guys are actually probably a little more formal in that you actually have a certificate program as opposed to just taking a 2 or 3 day training. So I think that the need is definitely there. I think the only challenge is that when people take a sort of a piecemeal, they'll take a improvisational science communication training, they'll take a how to develop a message box training. And there isn't, what ends up happening is there's a fragmentation kind of understanding the field as a whole and where what you're learning fits in. And so while I think it's really important, I also think there's also got to be a role for a bigger discussion about what the field actually is, because I find many people will take an introductory course and then they sort of think that's it, or they're looking for more opportunities and they aren't there, or there just isn't a larger theory of what it is we're actually doing in this field that people are, get disconnected from. So I hope my book helps play a bridging role to a future in which there's just that we discuss this in a more clear way, because more and more people are becoming science communicators. It's a growing and very large field, and we need to sort of have at least some collaborative spirit amongst all these informal training sets.
Yeah, I just from my own experience, I see that when we start to put names on things, that's when we see a lot of coalescence around an idea. And I think that's one thing your book does incredibly well, is it names SciComm practitioners as real people who are doing real work. And although we've talked about that in the community for a long time, I really feel strongly that your book does it in such a wonderful way that maybe we'll get a little bit more traction to that.
One hopes.
We did have a question come up in the chat box from James Manley. They say, where do interpretive programs intersect with these ideas about relational science communication?
That's a really, really good question. So one of the videos that I'll often show in a, in-person training, it's a little harder to do here, but I have found, so for example, there's some really interesting work at like the Monterey Bay Aquarium, at the National Park Service, where people are sort of questioning like, what is this role? And those sort of informal science learning spaces have actually piloted some of this work that I think could be much more widely spread. So there's a video from the Monterey Bay Aquarium that I absolutely love, where they're using when I watch it, I think of as motivational interviewing, which is sort of a psychoanalytic terminology. And they're basically using it to ask us, one person is asking somebody else how they think about climate change, and sort of just asking questions, and kind of have the person that they're talking to comes to their own conclusions. And that to me is a very, very relational framework, right? And then there's a great one also from the National Park Service, where they're talking about the evolution of their own climate change program, where they were basically saying that, for example, they they, whoever they are, the decision makers in that space, had this sense that they could not talk to visitors about climate change. But what they were actually noticing was that people wanted to talk about climate change. And so they took this relational perspective where they decided, well, people are asking, so maybe instead of us deciding in advance that nobody wants to talk about this, we'll actually answer the questions that people are asking us, right? So again, it seems so fundamental, but it's really not how science communication has tended to operate.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another wonderful key point. And we have time for just about one more question observation. I don't see another one in the chat, but I will just say, I really appreciate this book. I've been a science communicator, I think, since I was 16 years old, and I started working as a volunteer guide at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And it's just so wonderful to see the attention given to this in such a beautiful way. I do see Sabrina has her hand up, so I'll let her get to that last question.
Thank you. So recently I'm doing a lot of work on how people are utilizing natural resources in the Los Angeles River, including sustenance fishing, mostly undertaken by the homeless community and some low-income communities there. And I guess my question is back to that question about how we sort of frame what is science, what is environment, those kinds of things, and where things like fishing and hunting fit in when people are sort of relating to nature in such different ways.
Yeah. But is that a comment, or was there a question in there?
Oh, it was a question. I mean, I wanted if you had a response to that, like how, I mean, that's one conflict, right? That comes up a lot, like people who want to just conserve all living things, and people who maybe they are interested in conservation too, but they're utilizing.
Yeah. I mean, so for me, I would look at that as, I would name it for what it is, that there's a conflict, right? Which is the first step in this entire thing, is to actually being able to name the thing for what it is. And then to think about what it then means to work with conflict. And I get into some of that in the book, where I'm trying to describe that there's a theory of conflict work that has to do with, it led largely by Peter Coleman, that has to do with when you get into these polarized situations where things are black and white, that what you often actually need is a lot of gray area in the middle. And so for me, I would probably, if I were thinking about how to work with that as a conflict, I would try to get into what the gradation between those two perspectives actually are, instead of kind of getting into it's a this versus that. And that's kind of what I've noticed in the many conflict issues I work on as well, water, things like that, that the more you can kind of tease out that there aren't just two perspectives, there are 200. And so we're not actually fighting like that. That's one way, but I'm happy to consult with you on that actual issue at some other point.
It's been interesting to follow like online conversations about Seaspiracy.
And that, Faith, was a great answer to Bob Carey, who also had a question about working with people who just had a very different view of science and those sorts of things. But I do want to acknowledge that it is 1 p.m. and we are wrapping up. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Kearns, for being here today. I want to thank everybody who's been here for participating.